Hello, everyone out there, and welcome to another episode of Managing Your Energy with Healer Holly. Girls, guys, everyone in between, this episode is going to be on vulnerability. Yes, I say that slowly. It's a big word already, but it deserves that weight. And it's been a lifelong lesson for me, learning to manage my vulnerability. What does it mean to me? What are the right times? What are not the right times? And I'm going to go through that. Simple steps and stories to back them up so that you can have real life examples, because I think that's what we're missing in our life a lot of the times. What does this look like? Okay, that's a bunch of words. What does it look like? And that's why I bring my stories. Also, I draw a lot from Brené Brown. She's a vulnerability researcher and expert. And guys, I encourage everyone out there to read the book Daring Greatly by Brené Brown. And if you don't read the book, at least watch her TED Talks on YouTube. There's some of the most watched TED Talks on YouTube, and she has been a guiding beacon for me ever since reading her book on the idea of vulnerability. And also, all the validations are not on my own relationship with vulnerability. Just an amazing book. I think I cried while I read it. So without further ado, here's the episode, guys. Okay, I paused there to go look for my copy, but I think I must have given it away because this book, I just think it's a vessel of love. I just think it's a little carriage of love. And the book I'm talking about is Brené Brown, Daring Greatly. Now, she has a really highly watched, I think some of the most highly watched TED Talks out there, like in the double digits of millions. Watch that for a starter. Brené Brown, TED Talks on vulnerability. But read the book, guys. Read the book. I'm pretty sure I cried while I read it. Because you know when you've been waiting for someone just who's an authority to validate what you already just feel deep down in your soul? Well, her book was definitely one of those. I've been a nice person most of my life. Now I'm going into lessons of standing in my power because, guys, the universe will take you to the lessons that you need to encounter. And you can be a nice person the whole time, but how much are you compromising yourself? So anyway, let's stick to it. Vulnerability. So I was having this conversation with a friend yesterday, and he was complaining about his old flatmate. His old flatmate who he moved out from because he couldn't stand his boyfriend. So my friend moved out from this place because he couldn't stand his flatmate's boyfriend. And he asked him for his stuff back, and he was upset that his old flatmate posted it all in a package without a letter or anything. And he said he was concerned for him because his old flatmate, my friend's old flatmate, had a burnout from his job, quit his job, is living in the flat on his own, and is not being vulnerable. He's not sharing anything about it. So guys, I'm gonna give vulnerability a bit of nuance in this. Somebody thinks you should just be blindly vulnerable all the time. And this is what I used to do. I used to just be blindly vulnerable because I just thought that was the right way to do it. Well, you know what it turned out I was doing as well? A, oversharing. B, potentially giving my power away to someone who I can't trust to be that vulnerable around. Guys, be vulnerable around the people, and this is in the book, be vulnerable around the people who have earned your trust. Yeah? So if someone failed your trust when you were vulnerable around them, someone is going to, even if you love them. So if you love them, if they're tribe, if it's not a consistent thing, if it's not costing you too much, it was just a moment where they could learn a lesson, then be compassionate and patient. But pull yourself back and give yourself what you need. But I used to find myself in a lot of relationships where I really believed in vulnerability. But I realized I was doing the work for both of us. I was being vulnerable for the both of us, and that was making them really feel comfortable, and my partners used to really fall in love with me. But I think because they were quite often injured, and that made them feel safe because it gave them a modicum of control. because I would take responsibility for things that actually, you know, you can always find a reason to take responsibility for something that happened. And I would do that for things that were not really, it was taking their responsibility as well by being the only one who reaches that point of being vulnerable. And if you're with that person, it doesn't make you feel comfortable, you value vulnerability, get out of there. Get out of there. What's the point? But also, guys, there's lessons in power around vulnerability. So coming back to my friend and his flatmate, I started to think about everything that I'm learning about anxiety and everything that all these rebirths that are happening with people during COVID and them finding themselves. And I thought to myself, maybe he doesn't need to reach out to you. You moved out, you know? And maybe he's all right. You said he burnt out and that's why he quit his job. So maybe that's a rebirth for him. Maybe there's a relief in there. And maybe, you know, it's anxiety-ridden stuff. He's back in the open market for a job. But maybe that is the difficult process of changing career paths. But it was the right time for him. And it's actually going to be, the fruits on the other side of this journey are going to be so much more worth his time and his peace and his peace of mind. And so in that sense, not being vulnerable is kind of keeping the energy to yourself and letting yourself know that you are capable of going through this journey. So guys, this is why I'm tying vulnerability to managing your energy, because there is an energy in that. There's an energy in always professing what is not going wrong and just flailing and not really doing anything about it. It's one thing to reach out and ask for help, but it's another thing to just constantly complain and then call that vulnerability. That is actually victim mode. And guys, I've been guilty of this. And there's also been times, okay, here's how I've mapped it out. Vulnerability, in my opinion, the really inspiring moments to use it. When someone feels awkward around talking about something that they shouldn't. Like, I'll give you guys an example. I used to have hemorrhoids that bled. Hemorrhoids, that's butt stuff, and they used to bleed. And I used to make a joke, like, now I can empathize way more with women in their periods. I know what it's like to be a human being and see like blood coming from your body. And me, it wasn't just, you know, one period of the month. It was consistently for like months and sporadically for a couple of years. And it really opened me up. It made me vulnerable. And it made me compassionate, it made me expansive, and it made me not judge, you know, and then I found out how common hemorrhoids are. So if a friend of mine wanted to talk about that, I was like, yeah, I've been through it all. I've been through the operation. I've been through da-da-da-da. And they're being vulnerable around something that is just so human in the first place. That puts the conversation at ease. So if it's something you've overcome and you've healed from and you just think it's silly the way people are reticent around talking about this, that kind of vulnerability, amazing. That's strength, because we're so ashamed of so many silly things that are just happening to every one of us. And I'm sure a lot of ailments caused by shame are due to that tension around the topic, especially if you're thinking in terms of hemorrhoids. That's a constriction. Maybe there's something I need to be more vulnerable about. Maybe there's something I could open up about. Ailments in the body will also be reflected in our psyche. The second time I think it's great to be vulnerable is when you have toxic compensatory behaviors around not being vulnerable. Like you're just kind of overburdening yourself. And here's an example. So my ex, I think we both did. I used to feel intimidated by the ideas of her exes that she mentioned, because they were also crazily interesting. You know, like aerial yoga instructor, lived in Bali, like some kind of dominatrix, tantric guru, some guy who was like a music producer and engineer, and it made me feel like, why me? You know, obviously that's my own issues of reframing my own self-worth and how I see myself. A lot of times, I feel like if I could see myself the same way other people saw me, then I would be flying through life. But that's another episode. And that's a self-love episode. Stay tuned for that one. I'm learning about it though. But what I noticed is every time she spoke about one of these guys, I would just kind of, like as a rule for fairness, I would do this kind of spiritual whitewash. And I would just think to myself, yeah, no, there's no point in me bringing up jealousy or envy about these other guys. There's no point in feeling that. It's not fair. It's not right. Everyone has a past, and she's actually communicating about it. But the truth is, anytime I brought up someone else from my past, which I usually only would, and again, this ties into the vulnerability, I would only really usually bring up someone from my past when I would show a behavior that I realized I'm still working through, and I'd be like, oh, yeah, you need to know that I went through this with someone from my past, and so it has this effect on me now. And that, I think, is relatable to any of us. But again, you want to be vulnerable when it releases tension. You don't want that to become an excuse to be able to ignore that behavior and hold up that excuse as a crutch. So if you're gonna bring up the excuse, be vulnerable and go, oh yeah, and so I would only bring it up when I failed, when I failed too much, and I was like, look, I'm still working through this. I might need you to be considerate of this. And then you can be considerate back of what they need. This is in relationships specifically, I guess with friendships as well, what they need a bit of consideration around. And that's coming from the heart, guys. That's coming from the heart. And I'm still learning about that because I was psychologized and I just go, well, you should be da-da-da-da-da-da. And like, really, if you're working on yourself, ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba. But it's a balance, because sometimes just going, oh, I got to consider that, like, actually they're coming from all this stuff. And then you don't feel affected by their behavior. You can just go, instead of my ego responding, my heart's responding, and I'm responding empathetically. Don't compromise yourself. But if you're coming from your heart, you can let the energy go, or you can even just have a more wise response to it. Like, I see that. I understand that this is all that's going on here. But also I've learned that if I stay in the crossfire of this, it costs me this. So I'm going to graciously leave with love. Or look, they just need someone around right now. I understand what they're going through, and it's not even about this. And maybe if I just hold space, they'll get to the other side, they'll get out of that energy, and then they'll be available again. Like it depends on you. It depends on your priorities of importance with this person, with the relationship, with how you're feeling with yourself and where you are personally. So guys, a lot of things to consider here. But as I was saying, back to my story with my ex, she would have a little agitation openly anytime I mentioned an ex, even if it was just to say, oh yeah, I'm working through this. So I'm going to be vulnerable and let you know, because that's an issue that's going to become an energy in the relationship. And she, instead of taking on, like, why I was bringing it up, she would have jealousy, but she made it obvious, and I could tell she knew. It wasn't worth, just like I did, like it wasn't worth bringing up, but she was, and I'm like, what? It's like, I get really jealous and I used to project. I get really jealous when you mention someone from your past, and I used to project and think, well, you shouldn't, because I don't when you do. But what she was doing was at least releasing that energy. I took it personally, but she was releasing that energy and then moving on, shaking it through and getting past it. And that was a lesson that I need to learn. This is a thing we can do. So what happened is I pent up all these feelings of inadequacy built up on jealousy. And even though she saw me as something, someone worthy, interesting, inspiring. She believed in my potential just because she knew who I was on a regular day-to-day basis. That actually the days that I came and just my feelings of inadequacy were too much and I would just break down, all that would happen was she would mirror my emotion. She would be there with me. She would stand in it with me. And then the tension was gone. But what was hard after that was, this person just saw me be weak. And I had real trouble accepting that it was cool for me to still be around this person. That I'm going to remain attracted to this person. And that was where hitting my edge, touching the edges of my anxiety, really, that was a lesson that I needed to work with. And it's pushed me away from several relationships, actually, just not being able to sit in that anxiety and kind of go, well, this is where I'm at. I guess if this loses me the relationship, then it just wasn't meant to be. And knowing that I'm working on myself more than anything else. Because that's surrender, that's letting go. And in my experience, usually when you surrender and let go, non-attachment, that's a moment of non-attachment. That's like a pitfall. Well, I guess if I'm not enough here, then I find out. Usually things surprise you. And that is moving from the known into the unknown, where usually our ego would activate and we'd have all these compensatory behaviors around it. And we'd just suck the person into some weird projection or shadow story that we don't need. And eventually I broke up with that person. And a couple of weeks after, I was coming home from work. I just taught at the school, and for some reason my psyche, and your psyche will know, my psyche was like, you walk home. That was a long day. Don't take the bus. It's okay. It's 25-minute bus ride, but it's 40-minute walk. Just walk. You could do with the walk. You could do with the headspace. I walked home, and then when I got home, I felt like, I didn't do my yoga in the morning. I really want to do exercise. I really want to get my exercise in. And I just had this agitation around really wanting to do my exercise. And I went to my room and I started doing my yoga. And in the middle of one of my downward dogs, just like, woof, 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 these epiphanies just started sparking off in my head. And I just broke down, and I realized what the epiphanies was about my ex, about I never expressed my fears of inadequacy. And I judged hers. And I wasn't vulnerable enough. And then it like flashes, like every time I was vulnerable, all it did was bring us down to the level, to the same level. And I was like, wow. And it never made me unattractive. It would have just made things what they were meant to be. And I also had this other epiphany of like, that's what love is. That's what relationship is. It doesn't exist without the fear that you might lose someone else. That's the whole tension of it. That's why it's so big. That's why it's a life of its own. Romantic love, it's a life of its own. So guys, to sum that up, vulnerability in a moment, and this doesn't have to be with a loved one, it doesn't have to be so loaded. I just thought I would share, this was a story that came to mind, so I would share this example. And there's lots of layers in that story. You can relate it to friends. You know, what are you judging about them that actually might just be solved with some vulnerability? Or is it because you realize they're letting go of that energy by being vulnerable about that? Whereas they could actually sit with it, like I said in the beginning, sometimes you can sit with it, let your body know you can feel it, and the subconscious will find a way through. So these are kind of the two journeys, and you balance between opening new pathways that way. I can sit here, I can feel this, and actually I can show myself that without needing to compensate with this need or that need or that need. And check them. Sometimes those are addictions and not vulnerabilities. Are you addicted to dispelling the energy? Do you take other people's counsel when you're vulnerable, and then it doesn't allow you to, and then you just get addicted to that energy release rather than actually forming a plan around it? And then is that the time when the friend goes, look, I don't want to hear about this anymore. How are we gonna solve it? That's a good friend. And then you can learn to foster that ability for yourself. Guys, I'm still learning that. But this is what I see, this is what I understand, this is what I know, and so I'm sharing where I'm at. It depends where you are with yourself, and this is just a bit of information. So there's two ways. Can I sit with it? How much can I feel? How much can I know that I can still get myself through it? And stay positive and have the energy and courage to go through it? Or have I hit something and the vulnerability is making me act in other ways that are actually more detrimental than letting myself feel it? And can I be vulnerable to kind of navigate this in a different way? Because actually, one of the problems is I don't know that I'm allowed to be vulnerable in front of this person. So a lot to think about. And guys, eventually all this stuff, I've been realizing a lot of these rules, a lot of this stuff about rules and stuff, information and stuff, it's good stuff to have until you start to really find yourself and your intuition. It's contours around which you build yourself and you realize what works for you. And that's really important to mention. That you find what works for you, and then sometimes that'll change, and sometimes someone will be the sign for a new way that you can go into. That's up to you. One thing, and this is another thing that I do, don't take millions of advice. Don't take 100 billion people. Sometimes you can get lost in looking for advice, especially with YouTube, especially with all this stuff. And that's why at some point, when you know you've worked on something hard enough, disciplined enough, you've played with this concept. I'm going to use vulnerability this way. I'm going to reframe anxiety this way. I'm going to use gratitude this way. Although gratitude, I think, is just a universal. That's a good thing. That's just positivity, programming positivity into the body. Those little subtle things of just programming positivity into the body, that'll do the subtle work. That's a feminine energy. That will do the subtle work for you. But all the other advice, eventually, when you know you've worked with it, you've practiced it in a disciplined way, you have to start intuiting and listening to your intuition, listening to your body, listening to your inner guidance, truth, and wisdom. And that stuff is kind of the stepping stones and the learning blocks towards that. So guys, there's a lot to unpack in this episode, managing your energy vulnerability. I hope you guys have enjoyed. Thank you for holding space for me and allowing me to be vulnerable, sharing these stories. Hopefully it helps people out there. This is Healer Holly. Like and subscribe if you've enjoyed this episode. Peace and love, and over and out.